This brief recording is going to talk a little bit about what some people call Tier 2 instruction, but that we often call focused instruction. And as with all things, we start with thinking about what it is we are teaching, and we situate that back into our multi-tiered system of support. We think again about what is a universal outcome for all kids, or rather a common outcome for all kids, what might be a targeted outcome for some kids, and what might be some individualized outcomes for kids who need more personalized learning. So we're really going to think about this middle chunk of kids. And oftentimes, as we think about triangles and we think about how every child is a triangle, and we even think further about how they morph from one shape to the next, right now we're going to land on this sort of diamond shape, this idea that we're somewhere here in the middle. Whether or not we are a child with a disability, or whether we are just struggling, or whether our development has stalled, is sometimes it just doesn't matter. So what we know is that all learners at some point will struggle, and all learning and development may stall if we don't have the right supports and the right instruction being delivered. So we're going to talk a little bit about 4 reasons that kids struggle. And so the first 2 are the least likely to then translate into an individualized education plan, an IEP plan. That said, the older the child, and in particularly as we think about early elementary, the more we think about students, so the older you are and the less you have a disability or delay or disorder, meaning there's less of an impact or less of a gap between what is expected and what you're doing, then these 2 might come into play as worthy of meeting IEP goal criteria. However, in general, it doesn't matter. If a kid is struggling, there could be all sorts of reasons why. Whether or not they are qualifying for services is sort of secondary. So let's talk about each one. The child is having, or a group of children is having trouble with a complex skill. They are struggling with a concurrent skill. They're struggling with generalizing, and or they're struggling with adapting and adjusting. So especially in preschool and early elementary, children are learning really complex skills, like to participate, like how things are related or how they are associated. And they're starting to engage in this broad context of inquiry. Each of these, participation, association, and inquiry, as you can see, have subparts. Now, you could argue there are even more subparts than what I've listed out here, but this is to give you an idea that a common outcome, something that all children might be learning, could be further broken down. So let's take associations. There are at least 4 major ways we can conceptualize the broad outcome of association, and that's quantity, size, spatial, and temporal. As you notice right here next to quantity, we've already got, there's concepts, there's terms, there's number tags, there's weight, there's length. So there's this idea of measurement, there's this idea of being able to count. We could then get deeper into number and number sense. So it's not just that there are these single things. So even within associations, there's multiple layers and multiple levels of complexity. The idea is that we want to drill in, we want to get closer from our assessment data to figure out, why are you struggling? Why don't you have these skills coming along as we might expect? So in this instance, if we find that there is a component of a broader skill that the child is missing, then that is what we drill in on. So if the child's struggling with quantity as a part of associations, we just drill in and focus on quantity. If it's size, if it's spatial, or if it's temporal, versus interrelating all of them and broadly speaking to associations. Again, this is temporary. This is something that we're kind of trying to think about jump starting. So this is something that within a couple of weeks, a month, we should see changes in the child's performance. So we don't want to just talk louder out in the hallway. We really want to be more intentional, provide greater support, greater opportunities, and more individualized opportunities to focus in on either quantity or size or spatial or temporal. The second reason that children or groups of children may be struggling is that development is highly interrelated. Especially the older we get, it gets more variable, and it's so complex at this point that you can't tease apart fine motor from language. You can't separate out feeding from interests. So these things that seem completely the opposite are really not. They're all happening concurrently. They're all happening and are necessarily happening together. So often if you think of the analogy of a three-legged or four-legged stool, you need multiple legs to hold the stool up. All legs need to be there. All legs need to be the same height, need to be the same sturdiness, and otherwise you start to wobble, or you don't have the stability or the success that you would expect. So imagine if you did, this stool had three legs to it: associations, one-to-one, and compare and contrast. These are highly related skills, and so a child may be struggling not because of comparing and contrasting, but because they don't really have one-to-one. Or you think it's associations, but it's really this ability to compare and contrast. So while these things are happening concurrently, we might see a lag in one area until another area catches up or can be strengthened through this sort of more focused instruction. So in this instance, you would figure out which concurrent skill. So this will sound a lot like I'm just teaching the common outcomes louder and in the hallway. Nope, you're really just saying, okay, these things go together. These things have to happen concurrently. They need to jointly be present for the child to be able to do the skill. Which part of the stool is the child struggling with, and how can I give more focused instruction on that leg of the stool, as well as more learning opportunities. Then we get to something that many special educators are familiar with, which is generalizability. But in this case, we're really thinking about kids need to be able to do things in lots of different ways. And we need to be able to do that across time, across settings, across activities, across people, across materials. So we don't want the kid to just be able to do it with familiar adults in a very highly structured activity where there's only two other children. We really need kids to be able to do it when they're at Target, when they're at grandma's house, when they're at Head Start, when they're on the playground, when they're with unfamiliar people, when they're doing things that they'd rather not be doing, but they can still demonstrate the skill. So this idea of generalizability is really that the kid uses the skill. The child really demonstrates the skill across time, across settings, across people, and across materials. So an example of something that we might write as a targeted outcome, whether we write it as an IEP goal is a secondary question, but we don't really care what it is. So you'll notice there is an X in this phrase, and so it makes it grammatically kind of hard to read, but it just means fill in the blank. It means whatever it is, I want the kid to do it across time. So here's our 4 consecutive days, that's across time. Large group, small group, and one-on-one. So that's sort of this idea of across time, across settings or across different types of activities. I also want the kid to do it during planned and self-directed activities. It's not only the size of the group, but kind of the structure or lack of structure to the activity. And then we have across people, so I want at least 2 different peers in this instance. And then across materials, so I want manipulatives, writing implements, and art and construction materials, so that I really see that this skill has become robust. It's across time, it's across settings or activities, it's across people, in this case peers, and it's across different types of materials. And the last reason, or maybe not the final reason, but the last one we'll talk about, is when children have trouble adapting or adjusting. The analogy I usually kind of use so that people understand what I mean here is, think about when you go to your favorite restaurant and you order dinner. And you tend to have the same thing at the same restaurant because it's your favorite thing at that restaurant. And then the server comes back and says, we're very sorry, but we're all out of whatever it is you just ordered. So this ability to say, well, I have a backup. I can eat something different. That's kind of going with the flow versus saying, well, the night is completely ruined. I'd rather never eat again. I'm going home. So this idea to respond to changes versus reacting. And one of the words that we use is generative, which is going to sound an awful lot like what we just talked about, which is generalizability. However, in this instance, generative is this sort of ability to deduce what needs to happen and then make a plan and adjust from there. So I need to open a jar and I need to apply more force or less force depending on the resistance the lid gives me. Same thing with a grasp. If I want to open a door, if I want to pick up a writing implement, I'm going to think about how much of my whole hand, how much of my fingers, maybe how much of both hands do I have to use in order to grasp or pick something up. So how much effort, how much force, what size. And this is what we mean by generative, that kids can grasp all different kinds of sized objects. They can apply different amount of forces as they need to. It's also a rather social, emotional, or executive functioning type of skill in the sense that I can follow different rules, that I can act differently in different places, that I understand that there are different social norms that I have to adhere to when I'm at home versus when I'm on the playground versus when I might be at a place of worship. So we really want to think about this being able to adjust, to adapt, to go with the flow. And that even comes down to my ability to selectively attend to things. So what is the relevant stimuli? When can I stop looking at something or stop reacting to something and move my attention to another stimuli, another input, if you will, so that I can stop reading and I can look at the screen. I can move from the screen to the person talking. I can move from one person talking to the next person talking. I can count objects by knowing which objects I'm supposed to count and which objects are not part of the conversation. So this ability to kind of go with the flow, respond versus react, and have generative skills is really critical to us being successful in daily routines. So when we find that this is what a child or group of children are struggling with, then what we teach is this ability to adapt, this ability to adjust. So here's another example. Again, whether it becomes an IEP goal is secondary. So during conversations with adults and peers, so I'm just kind of setting this context, the child's going to do several things, and this is going to sound wordy, but you get the idea that the kid's going to make lots of changes. So when they're talking with other people, they can change their vocabulary. They can change how long their utterance is. They can change their volume, use your inside voice, use your outside voice. They can change the intonation to match the situation so that if it's at a game, they know that they can talk really loud and show excitement, but when they're in the library, they have to be more reserved and talk quietly. The topic of the conversation, they know how to change with the interest of their partner, of the what things we can talk about at the kitchen table for dinner and which things are not kind of conversation starters for dinner. And then we can also understand my partner's needs and my partner's levels. So what can they handle in terms of how long I talk, what I talk about, and how I repair some of those conversations. And that's just one example of how children can adjust or adapt in terms of having conversations with others.